Welcome back to the Deep Dive, the place where we wrestle with dense concepts so you can walk away well-informed, fast. Our mission today is a big one. It's a journey into what is arguably the most significant intellectual watershed in modern history, the critical philosophy of Immanuel Kant. We are tackling the core of his thought, the critique of pure reason.
A massive, intricate work.
Exactly. Written from the quiet Prussian city of Königsberg in the late 18th century. Our goal here is to quickly and thoroughly understand the foundational shift he enforced, how he managed to synthesize these two warring schools of thought, rationalism and empiricism.
And, the consequences his system had for everything we thought we knew about knowledge, about metaphysics, and even about faith. We truly cannot overstate the gravity of this subject.
Yeah.
Kant's critical philosophy is really the definitive point of no return for modern thinking. When we talk about a seismic shift, this is what we mean.
It's the definition of it.
It is. It's comparable in magnitude only to, the actual scientific revolution from Copernicus, who displaced the Earth from the center of the universe.
And Kant did the same thing, but for the mind.
He did the same thing intellectually. He demanded a complete reconfiguration of how we understand the human mind's relationship to reality. He didn't just provide new answers to old questions. He fundamentally changed the entire premise of the philosophical game.
What's so fascinating about this particular historical moment is the profound simultaneous revolutions taking place. There's a deep irony, right? Halfway across the world, around 1776, Americans were seeking political autonomy, self-legislation, the right of the subject to give the law to itself.
The Declaration of Independence.
Exactly. And at the very same time, Kant is holed up in Königsberg, meticulously finalizing his masterpiece.
The Critique of Pure Reason, which comes out in 1781. And it's achieving the exact same goal, but on an intellectual and moral scale.
Wow.
His whole project was fundamentally about severing the mind's dependence on external dogmatic authority, whether that's the church or tradition, or even just pure deductive logic.
He wanted to establish the absolute autonomy of human reason.
The autonomy of reason. Both revolutions, the American and the Kantian, were rooted in this idea of the subject becoming self-legislating, giving the law to itself.
Whether that's the law of the state or the law of the mind. Okay, let's define this central mechanism right away, because it's the key to unlocking everything else. The Copernican Revolution of the mind.
Yes.
What was the intellectual standard before Kant, and how did he flip the script so violently?
For millennia, pre-Kantian philosophy, whether it was rationalist or empiricist, operated on one seemingly inescapable assumption.
Which was?
The mind must conform to objects to acquire knowledge. We look at a tree, and our internal idea of the tree must accurately reflect the external tree.
Right. Truth was defined by that ancient maxim, adequatio re et intellectus.
The correspondence of the mind to the thing itself. The object dictates reality to the mind.
Which, again, seems completely intuitive. I mean, if I close my eyes and think of a dog, that thought should correspond to the dogs that exist outside my mind.
Intuitive, yes, but, as we're going to see with Hume, it's deeply problematic.
Yeah.
So Kant proposed this radical inversion. He said, suppose that for knowledge to be universal and necessary, objects must conform to the mind.
Wait, hold on. How can objects conform to the mind? That sounds like we're just making up the universe, like solipsism or something.
He's not saying we make up the raw material of reality. He's saying that the necessary structures of reality as we experience them, things like space, time, and causality, are not intrinsic properties of the world in itself.
But they're what?
They are necessary, a priori contributions of the knowing subject.
So we wear philosophical spectacles that automatically process and structure the input we receive.
Exactly.
And that structure is universal because all human minds are equipped with the same spectacles.
Precisely. Space, time, and the law of causality are the built-in operating system, the spectacles through which we view, organize, and make sense of the universe.
So we can know a priori before experience that everything we encounter will be in space and time.
Because the mind supplies those categories as a necessary condition of perception itself.
That implication is just staggering. If he's right, then we are immediately, permanently separated from reality as it truly is.
Yes.
We only know the reality that's been filtered through our human cognitive structure.
That is the essential consequence. This inversion was Kant's grand solution to a dual crisis. First, to rescue objective knowledge from the corrosive skepticism of David Hume.
And second,
to curb the wild, speculative, empty systems built by the continental rationalists. And the result of this synthesis is this great impassable chasm between the phenomenal the world as it appears to us.
And the noumenal, the world as it exists in itself, completely independent of us.
And it's that distinction that really defines the rest of modernity.
And it dismantled centuries of thinking about science, philosophy, and religion. We're going to spend the rest of this deep dive unpacking exactly how Kant built this structure, where its limits are, and how he tried to rebuild faith not on intellectual proofs, but on moral necessity. Okay, let's unpack this. Before we get into the dense mechanics of the philosophy, the sensibility, the understanding, the categories, let's look at the man himself, Immanuel Kant.
Born in 1724, Königsberg, Prussia.
Right. What shaped this revolutionary thinker? You often get the impression that philosophers just emerge fully formed from abstract thought, but Kant was deeply a product of his time and especially his upbringing.
He was, in a profound way. His personal history provided the necessary moral substrate for the towering intellectual system he would later construct. Kant was raised in a devout pietist household.
And pietism was a reform movement within Lutheranism, correct? Sort of a spiritual renewal movement.
Exactly. It emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries in reaction against what they saw as the cold formality and rigid dogmatic orthodoxy of the established Lutheran Church.
So less about rules, more about personal faith.
Yes. Pietism stressed personal conversion, individual devotion, fervent moral application, and the primacy of the inner light.
The internal intent.
The internal intent over mere external ritual or religious formalism.
So it focused on the heart and the internal commitment, not just checking boxes.
Precisely. This upbringing instilled in Kant a deep, almost visceral respect for the absolute nature of the moral law. His later philosophical system, the entire structure of the Critique of Practical Reason, is essentially a secularization and systematization of this profound pietist moral sensibility.
So his suspicion of religious hypocrisy, of acts done out of fear or for reward.
It's a direct echo of his pietist roots. For Kant, morality would always be rooted in duty and the will, not in calculation or external authority.
That gives us the moral compass, but the intellectual architecture that came from the dominant philosophy taught in the German universities of his day.
That's right. His early, what philosophers call his pre-critical thought, was entirely dominated by the rationalism of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz and his interpreter, Christian Wolff.
The Leibniz-Wolffian philosophy.
The reigning academic orthodoxy. This school maintained an almost boundless faith in human reason.
They believed reason could discover everything without needing to look at the world.
Essentially, yes. They believed the human reason, unaided by messy sensory experience, could deduce the fundamental nature of reality, the soul, God, the world, through rigorous logical analysis alone.
Using principles like the law of contradiction.
And the principle of sufficient reason. For them, metaphysics was truly the queen of the sciences because it was thought to derive universal, necessary, and certain truths from concepts alone. Kant spent his entire early academic career believing this was the route to truth.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, because the transformation, the awakening, didn't come from another formal philosopher. It came from a political and educational thinker, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Tell us about that legendary moment of absorption.
It's one of philosophy's great anecdotes. Kant was famously, ridiculously punctual.
The locals set their watches by his daily walk.
They literally did. Yet, legend states he missed that walk only once because he was entirely absorbed reading Rousseau specifically, either Emile or The Social Contract. And this encounter fundamentally changed his view of humanity and philosophy.
How did Rousseau, who focused so much on political and human dignity, manage to shift Kant's rigid intellectual worldview?
Rousseau influenced him in two distinct, profound ways that fed directly into his later moral system. The first was humanization.
Humanization.
Kant confessed he started as an intellectual snob. He believed that only scholars possess true human dignity because they alone possess the intellectual rigor to deduce truth.
And Rousseau taught him otherwise.
Rousseau taught him that the true dignity of humanity lay not in intellectual prowess, which is rare and accidental, but in the moral capacity that is common to all people.
So a baker, a farmer, a scholar, all possess the same inherent moral worth.
Precisely. This realization led directly to his egalitarian moral philosophy, locating the power of moral legislation in every rational being, not just the intellectual elite.
And the second influence?
The second, more structural influence was autonomy. Rousseau's concept of the general will, the idea that political freedom means obeying a law that one has prescribed to oneself.
Rather than just acting randomly.
Exactly. That became the essential template for Kant's concept of moral autonomy. The moral agent, like the free citizen, is both the author of the moral law and the subject bound by it. Rousseau gave Kant the conceptual tools to internalize the political revolution into a moral and intellectual one. So while Pietism and Rousseau set Kant's moral compass toward autonomy and dignity, the epistemological crisis, the intellectual trigger that forced him to write the Critique of Pure Reason, that was pulled by the great Scottish skeptic David Hume.
Hume was the shock wave that broke the foundation of rational certainty. You mentioned Kant confessed. Hume interrupted my dogmatic slumber. What exactly did Hume do that was so devastating?
Hume attacked the most basic foundation of both science and metaphysics, the concept of causality.
Right. The rationalists believed the necessary connection between cause A and effect B was knowable by pure reason, an innate idea.
And scientists like Newton relied on it absolutely. Hume challenged them. He demanded, "Show me the necessity."
And what did Hume find when he looked?
He argued that when we observe the world, we never ever perceive the power or the force or the necessary connection by which A produces B.
We just see that one thing always follows another.
We only perceive that event A is always followed by event B, what he termed constant conjunction. If a billiard ball hits another, we see motion followed by motion. We do not see the invisible mechanism that forces the second ball to move.
We see 1,000 fires followed by smoke, but we never see the necessity demanding that smoke must follow fire.
Exactly. Hume concluded that our idea of causality is not a rational insight into reality,
But just what? A habit.
merely a deeply ingrained psychological habit or custom of expectation born from repeated experience. We expect the sun to rise tomorrow, not because we have rational proof of necessity, but because we are habituated to it.
That sounds like a technical academic point, but if that premise is accepted, the consequences for objective knowledge are, as you termed it earlier, catastrophic.
Catastrophic because the certainty of knowledge collapses entirely. First, science is ruined. Newtonian physics relies on universal, necessary, and certain laws. If causality is just a subjective habit of expectation, then force equals mass times acceleration is just a prediction we are strongly accustomed to, not an objectively true, necessary law of nature.
Science dissolves into mere probability.
And second, metaphysics.
Yeah.
All the grand arguments for God relied on moving from the observed world to an unobserved first cause.
The cosmological argument.
Yes, the philosophical bridge to God, the ability to leap from the contingent world to the necessary being, relied entirely on the principle of causality. If causality itself is an illegitimate subjective concept, then that entire philosophical edifice supporting natural theology just crumbles.
So Hume successfully destroyed the very possibility of rational metaphysics.
He did. And Kant was left with an impossible dilemma. He could either retreat into the soft, ungrounded dogmatism of rationalism, which Hume had demolished, or he could accept Hume's skepticism, which meant surrendering objective science and all claims to universal, necessary truth.
His entire intellectual life after this point became about finding a way out of that trap.
A profound synthesis. He needed to find a basis for universal, necessary truth that somehow remained grounded in experience, thus accepting Hume's critique, but avoiding the destruction of knowledge itself.
So Kant realized that the 18th century philosophical landscape had created this paralyzing impasse. Neither the rationalists nor the empiricists had the full answer.
And he summarized their failure in one of the most quotable, defining lines of his philosophy.
Thoughts without content are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind.
That perfectly encapsulates it. Let's look at the two sides again through that lens. The rationalists, Leibniz, Wolff, they had the concepts, the deductive logic, the innate ideas.
Allowing them to claim universal necessary truths.
But because they ignored sensory experience, the content, their grand systems, were ultimately empty, leading to conflicting, unprovable dogmatisms.
And the empiricists, like Locke and Hume, they started with the tabula rasa, the blank slate.
They insisted on raw sensory experience intuitions, or content. Their strength was grounding knowledge and observation, but their weakness was the inevitable slide into skepticism.
Without concepts to structure the input, all they had were fleeting sensory impressions.
Which were blind. They could never claim universal or necessary truths.
So Kant, the great synthesizer, needed a way to provide universal structure, the rationalist requirement that was simultaneously applied to sensory content, the empiricist requirement.
And this challenge led him to a crucial distinction regarding the types of judgments the mind makes. We have to grasp this distinction to understand how he built his solution.
Right. We have two traditional types of judgments. First, the analytic judgments.
Analytic judgments are logically necessary statements where the predicate is already contained within the concept of the subject.
The classic example being all bachelors are unmarried.
Exactly. Unmarried is part of the definition of bachelor. The statement is true by definition. They're uninformative, merely clarifying what we already know. And these are always a priori, known independent of experience.
And then we have synthetic judgments.
Synthetic judgments are informative. The predicate adds something genuinely new to the subject. This body is heavy. Heaviness is not part of the definition of body.
You have to actually go and lift it.
You have to observe it to know its weight.
Yeah.
Traditionally, these judgments are a posteriori, known through experience.
So the entire philosophical world assumed those two categories covered everything. If it's necessary, it's not informative. If it's informative, it's not necessary.
And Kant's revolutionary question was, can we have synthetic a priori judgments?
This is the pivotal moment of the critique. Can we have knowledge that is both universally necessary and certain, a priori and informative about the world, synthetic?
Kant argued that if we want to save mathematics and objective science, this type of judgment must exist.
Let's break down the mathematical example because it's so counterintuitive. Kant argued that 7 plus 5 equals 12 is actually synthetic.
It is a priori because it is universally true and necessary. You don't need to empirically check every addition of 7 and 5 throughout the universe.
Okay, that makes sense.
But Kant claimed it is synthetic because the concept of 12 is not analytically contained within the separate abstract concepts of 7, 5 and the process of addition.
The concept of 12 is a new thing.
The mind must perform a construction, a kind of mental counting or synthesis in time to reach the result. You must step outside the pure concepts of 7 and 5 to produce 12. Therefore, it is informative, synthetic, yet universally true a priori.
Now, what about the law of physics that Hume challenged? Every event has a cause.
This is a priori because we don't wait for every single event in history to prove it inductively. We assume it must be true for the universe to be intelligible.
And it's synthetic because
the concept of cause is not analytically contained in the pure concept of event. We can logically think of an event happening without a cause, even if we cannot physically experience one.
So these judgments are necessary and universal, yet they tell us something new about how the world must behave. If they exist, how on earth are they possible?
The only way they can be possible is if the necessity, the a priori element, comes from the structure of the mind itself, which then imposes that structure onto the sensory input, the synthetic element.
And this is his whole system.
Kant's entire critical system, the transcendental philosophy, is a systematic explanation of how the mind makes synthetic a priori judgments possible by dividing the mind into the faculties of sensibility and understanding. The answer to the synthetic a priori puzzle, as we established, must lie within the structure of the mind itself. Kant meticulously breaks down this internal operating system of knowledge, first through the faculty of sensibility, and then through understanding.
Let's start with A, sensibility, which Kant analyzes in the Transcendental Aesthetic. What is sensibility's fundamental job?
Sensibility is our passive capacity to receive representations. It is where the process of knowledge starts. When we encounter the world, we are hit by the sense manifold.
Which is just raw, chaotic sensation.
The raw, undifferentiated chaos of sensation. Blurs of color, unrelated sounds, unconnected heat and cold. This input is chaotic, fleeting, and unintelligible on its own.
And this is the very first step where the mind starts applying structure, even before we apply concepts like dog or chair.
Precisely. Kant argues that before any conceptualization can occur, we must order this chaos. This order is imposed by what he calls the pure forms of sensible intuition, space and time.
So they're not things we derive from experience.
No, they are the necessary framework, the spectacles that the subject contributes.
So space and time are the inherent dimensions built into our cognitive hardware?
Exactly. Space is the form of outer sense. We cannot perceive any external object without immediately structuring it spatially. Time is the form of inner sense.
How we perceive our own thoughts.
Our own psychological states, and how we necessarily organize the succession of external events. We can easily imagine space without objects, but we cannot imagine objects without space.
So space must come first. It's a condition for perceiving objects at all.
A condition of the possibility of appearances.
This solves a major problem, doesn't it? It validates geometry, which is built on the universal laws of space, like Euclid's axioms.
It does. It shows why geometry works a priori. We know, universally and necessarily, that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. Not because we have checked every instance, but because that is the necessary structure of the way we perceive space,
It's a truth about our internal organization.
which we then impose on all external data. This is the core of the Copernican shift. We bring the structure to the table.
But I have to stop you here and raise some friction. If space and time are merely contributions of the subject, doesn't that make Kant a radical relativist? You said he saved objective science, but if reality is just structured by our internal rules, how is my experience of a tree any more objective than someone else's?
That is the essential, often misunderstood tension in Kant. He avoids radical relativism because the sensibility and understanding he describes are universal human structures.
They're not unique to me or you.
No, they are the necessary shared operating system of all rational beings who experience the world spatially and temporally. So while we are locked into the phenomenal world, that world is objective for all human knowers.
Because we all share the same spectacles.
We all share the same spectacles.
Okay, that clarifies the objectivity claim within the human sphere. So sensibility takes the chaotic data and organizes it spatially and temporally. But as we said, that's still just a well-organized blur. We need the second faculty.
Be understanding. The transcendental analytic. The understanding is the mind's powerhouse, the active, spontaneous faculty that thinks objects. Its job is synthesis. It takes the raw sense manifold, now filtered in place in space and time, and synthesizes it, thinks it as a coherent unity.
It applies the necessary rules to turn data into a coherent object of experience.
And those rules are the categories.
The 12 pure concepts of the understanding.
Yes, they are structural requirements the mind possesses a priori and applies involuntarily.
Yeah.
Kant famously derived these categories like unity, substance, causality, and necessity from the complete table of logical judgments.
So for every way we can logically think about a proposition,
There's a corresponding concept required to construct a real object of experience.
give us an example of that link. How does a form of judgment connect to a category?
Consider the logical form of categorical judgment S as P. Subject is predicate.
Okay.
To make this statement about the world, the mind must use the category of substance and accident. We must assume that some enduring substratum, the substance S, underlies changing properties, the accidents P.
You don't observe substance directly.
Your mind applies that rule to make continuous experience possible.
So let's return to Hume's challenge on causality. If we don't observe causality, how does Kant bring it back as objective truth via the categories?
Hume was right that we don't see causality in the world in itself, but Kant argues Hume was wrong to conclude it was a mere psychological habit.
Because for Kant, it's what? A rule of the mind.
Causality is a structural, non-negotiable requirement that the mind applies to the succession of events to make objective experience possible.
Can we differentiate between a subjective succession of thoughts and an objective succession of events using the category of causality?
Absolutely. This is the core purpose of the categories. If I look at a house, I can scan my eyes from the roof to the foundation, or from the foundation to the roof.
The order is up to you.
The succession of perceptions is entirely in my mind. It is subjective and reversible. I can imagine the roof before the foundation, or vice versa.
But in the physical world,
If I see a ship moving downstream, the upstream position must precede the downstream position. I cannot mentally reverse that sequence without making an objective error.
and the category of causality is what makes that sequence necessary.
It's the rule that determines that specific sequence is necessary and irreversible. When the mind applies the category of causality, it transforms mere subjective association into an objective law of nature. The category is the necessary scaffolding that turns chaotic data into a world governed by necessary laws.
The categories are the necessary rules for coherence, but we still need Kant's most famous and difficult argument, the transcendental deduction. This is where he proves these categories are valid for all objects of experience.
Yes, and this is the philosophical engine room. The proof hinges on the transcendental unity of apperception.
Or the logical, I think.
Right. Kant argues that for any representation, any piece of sensory data to be my experience, the I think must be able to accompany it.
Meaning I must be aware that I am the one experiencing the thing.
Exactly. But here is the profound implication. For this I think to be a unified, coherent self, it must synthesize all its disparate experiences according to rules.
The categories.
Yes. If the chaotic manifold were not synthesized according to the categories, it would not belong to a single consciousness. It would be, as Kant says, an unintelligible rhapsody of perceptions, a stream of data belonging to no one in particular.
Let's use a concrete analogy. Imagine the mind is a massive database trying to organize information.
Okay.
If the raw data comes in with no inherent structure, the system would crash.
The categories are the necessary built-in organizational folders, the tags, the field, substance, causality, quantity, that I think is the master user who requires a unified login and coherent file structure.
If the data isn't sorted according to the categories, the I think can't unify it.
And therefore, it cannot be conscious of itself as a unified self. The categories are not just tools for knowing the world. They are the necessary conditions for self-consciousness itself.
So Kant has demonstrated that the categories, including the crucial concept of causality, are absolutely necessary and valid for any possible human experience. They structure the world, and they structure us as knowing subjects. So we have the complete structure of knowledge laid out in two faculties. Sensibility provides the messy, concrete, time-bound sensations.
And understanding provides the pure, abstract, timeless concepts, the categories.
But we still have this massive disconnect. How does the abstract, timeless category of cause actually grab onto the concrete, sequential experience of the ball hitting the glass?
This is the famous and famously obscure problem of the schematism.
It's the hinge upon which the entire system pivots.
It is. Categories and sensations seem fundamentally heterogeneous. They speak completely different conceptual languages. We need a translator or mediating concept.
And Kant finds that mediator in the one element shared by both realms.
The bridge is time. Time is the only element that applies both to abstract concepts, because concepts are ultimately rules for thinking in time, and to sensory phenomena, which must occur in time. Time is the universally present, pure form of intuition.
And it connects the abstract structure of thought to the concrete flow of appearance.
So the schema itself is defined as this translator. A schema is essentially a time determination, a procedural rule, or a recipe for applying a specific category to the sense manifold.
It's not a mental image.
No, it's a rule for producing an image in time. Think of the category as a vast theoretical concept like substance. The schema is the temporal rule. Substance is that which endures through time while its properties change.
That makes the abstract concrete. Let's look at our previous examples. If we have the category of quantity, how does the schema work?
The category of quantity gets applied via the schema of number. Number is defined as the successive addition of homogeneous units in time.
1, 2, 3, 4.
To count, you must proceed sequentially, and that sequence is ordered in time. The schema provides the mind, the temporal procedure for counting the objects delivered by the senses.
And the schema of causality, the concept that Hume attacked.
The category of causality is applied via the schema of succession. This is the rule that the effect must follow the cause in a necessary temporal order, succession, subject to a rule.
Without the schema, we'd just see one thing after another.
A followed by B followed by C with no necessary link. The schema imposes the rule of necessary temporal connection.
The schematism, therefore, simultaneously validates our objective scientific knowledge and imposes the radical limit of knowledge.
Precisely. The schematism confirms that the categories only have meaning. They only grab onto reality when applied to temporal phenomena.
So if you try to apply the category of causality outside the framework of time, say, to the realm of God or the soul,
they become empty forms. They're like a computer program with no executable file to process the rules.
This brings us to the great divide that defines modernity: phenomena versus noumena. We need to be crystal clear on this separation, as it's the ultimate consequence of the entire system.
The phenomena is the world as it appears to us. It is the world of empirical experience, nature, and objective science. The world governed by the laws of space, time, and causality.
And because it's governed by the universal categories, it's fully deterministic, predictable, and knowable.
And the noumena, or the things in themselves.
This is reality as it truly is, independent of our perception.
We can think the noumenon. We recognize that there must be something external that causes the sensations we receive, but we can never know it.
Because knowledge requires the application of categories via the schematism, and the noumenon is outside space and time.
Kant calls the noumenon a Grenzbegriff, a limiting concept. It's a concept that limits the boundary of our possible knowledge, preventing reason from straying into error.
Wait, if we can't know the noumenon, why keep it? Why not just say the phenomenal world is the only world?
That is precisely the challenge that the later idealists like Hegel and Fichte would level at Kant, they said. Discard the unknowable thing in itself.
But Kant insisted we must keep it.
Even if we can't access it. Because discarding it leads to an absurdity, the idea that our sensations are caused by nothing. It prevents the system from collapsing into pure subjective idealism.
And the profound theological consequence of this absolute limit.
The consequences are absolute. God resides entirely in the noumenal realm. God is not in space or time. He is not a sensory object. Since knowledge requires the categories to be schematized in time, God cannot be known by pure reason or empirical science. The philosophical bridge between the deterministic natural world and ultimate reality is definitively severed.
Metaphysics as the queen of the sciences is dead.
What's fascinating here is how Kant didn't just casually assert that metaphysics fails. He dedicated an entire section of the critique to systematically taking down the three classical proofs for God's existence.
He wanted to prove, once and for all, that speculative reason is utterly impotent in the realm of theology and ultimate reality.
He targeted the foundational arguments that had held sway in Western thought for centuries. Let's begin with one, the ontological argument.
The argument that you can derive God's existence purely from the definition of God.
Yes, championed by Anselm and later Descartes, the argument runs, God is defined as the most perfect being possible. Existence is a perfection. Therefore, God must exist.
This seems to imply that if you define something perfect enough, it must pop into existence.
Exactly, and Kant's surgical attack was devastatingly simple. Existence is not a real predicate.
What's a real predicate?
A real predicate, like heavy, yellow, or rational, adds to the concept of the subject. If I say the gold is yellow, the concept of gold is enlarged by the color predicate. Existence, Kant argued, does not enlarge or make the concept richer.
Let's use his most famous illustration, the 100 sailors example.
Imagine the concept of 100 possible sailors or dollars. This concept contains all the necessary predicates: value, metallic composition, round shape.
Got it.
Now, consider 100 actual thalers. The concept in your mind remains exactly the same. The actuality of the money adds nothing to the internal concept.
So what does existence do if it's not a predicate?
Existence merely posits the subject, along with all its predicates, in relation to reality. It doesn't enrich the concept, it just affirms the concept has reality outside of my thought. You cannot define God into existence.
So logic determines what God is, his essence, but not that he is.
Precisely. The ontological argument is logically flawed.
Next, 2. The cosmological argument, the argument from contingency, often called the first cause argument.
This argument is perhaps more intuitive. Everything contingent requires a cause, and we can't have an infinite regress of causes, so we must land on a necessary being that is uncaused.
Kant saw this as a nest of dialectical assumptions.
And he said it collapses on two crucial points.
Yeah.
First is the misapplication of causality, which ties back to the schematism. The cosmological argument takes the category of causality, which Kant has proven only applies to sensory events within space and time, and illegitimately uses it to infer a cause outside of space and time. You're trying to use a phenomenal tool to reach a noumenal reality.
Our minds are simply not equipped to make that leap.
It violates the limits of knowledge Kant just established. And the second failure.
A secret dependence on the ontological argument.
Right. Even if the cosmological argument successfully proves a necessary being exists, you still have the crucial step of identifying that necessary being as the ens realissimum, the most real or perfect being, which is God.
And to do that,
You have to secretly and implicitly revert to the failed logic of the ontological argument, assuming necessity implies perfection. If the ontological is gone, the cosmological falls with it.
And finally, 3, the teleological argument, the argument from design. The argument that the complexity and order of nature prove an intelligent designer.
Kant showed the most respect for this argument, calling it the oldest, the clearest, and the most accordant with the common reason of mankind. But it is logically insufficient. At best, it proves an architect of the world, an extremely powerful being who organized pre-existing matter into a complex structure.
Not a creator.
It does not prove an infinite, omnipotent creator who brought matter into existence ex nihilo. An architect organizes materials. A creator creates the materials themselves.
And to get from a limited designer to an infinite God, you have to again appeal to the other two failed arguments.
The collapsed cosmological and ontological arguments. So, all three proofs fail to achieve their goal using speculative reason.
This raises an important question. We have to impartially note the powerful philosophical critiques Kant's system received, particularly from traditional philosophical theology. R.C. Sproul's counterpoint is a good example. What is his central objection?
Sproul, among many others, argues that Kant's radical restriction of causality to the phenomenal boundary leads to the philosophical absurdity of unintentional intentionality.
Order and purpose that exist without an intender or designer?
Exactly. Sproul argues that Kant admitted the phenomenal world displays order, complexity, and purpose. But by denying that we can rationally infer a cause for that order outside the system, Kant is left asserting that this order is merely accidental purpose, which is a contradiction in terms.
So the dilemma is, if the phenomenal contingent world is an effect, reason demands an adequate cause.
Yes. By restricting the law of causality arbitrarily to the phenomenal boundary, Kant leaves the universe itself as a brute, unintelligible fact. Sproul's argument is that reason naturally seeks the unconditioned cause for the conditioned world.
And by blinding reason from making that inference, Kant forces us into an unintelligible position.
But Kant's restriction remained firm. While we may feel nature is design, we cannot prove it using pure reason. He closed the door to determinative knowledge of God.
Having rigorously closed the front door to knowing God through science or reason, Kant performed his brilliant maneuver. He opened the back door through morality.
The shift to the critique of practical reason.
And the primacy of practical reason.
It is truly a tactical masterpiece. Kant conceded that we cannot know freedom, immortality, or God, scientifically or metaphysically. But he argued that we must nonetheless believe in them as necessary conditions to make our shared moral experience coherent and rational.
And that moral experience manifests as the moral law, which he called the factum der Vernunft.
A simple, undeniable fact of reason that we all experience internally. This moral law expresses itself as the categorical imperative, an unconditional universal command that applies to all rational beings, irrespective of their personal desires or anticipated consequences.
And it's autonomous because it is self-legislated.
We impose it on ourselves because we are rational.
We must highlight the first formulation, the core idea of universality, as this is how we test our actions.
The first formulation is the universalization principle. Act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law.
So you test the rule behind your action against universalizability.
If, when everyone adopted your maxim, the world would dissolve into chaos or the maxim would destroy itself, then the action is immoral.
Let's apply a strong example, the famous case of the lying promise.
If I'm in financial trouble, my maxim might be, I will make a promise I know I cannot keep to secure money.
Okay, now universalize it.
If everyone made lying promises when convenient, the institution of promising itself would collapse. The moment you state, I promise, the listener knows the statement is meaningless because promises are no longer trusted. The maxim, when universalized, destroys the concept of promising.
And since you cannot rationally will the destruction of the very institution you are trying to use, the lying promise is immoral.
Exactly.
The very command of this law carries a massive implication of freedom.
This is crucial. If the moral law commands us, thou shalt or thou shalt not, it logically implies ability. I ought, therefore I can.
We must be free.
We must postulate that we are free agents capable of choosing the moral law over our phenomenal desires, despite the determinism that science dictates in the phenomenal world. This postulate of freedom is necessary for genuine moral agency.
So we have the moral law requiring freedom. But Kant also needed to connect moral worth to the ultimate goal of human existence, the summum bonum, the highest good.
The highest good is defined as the perfect union of virtue, moral worthiness, achieving holiness, and happiness, well-being. Reason demands that the virtuous person ultimately be happy.
But immediately we face the practical antinomy, a contradiction in reality.
In the phenomenal deterministic world we observe, there is no necessary connection between virtue and happiness.
The righteous often suffer miserably, and the wicked often prosper.
So if adherence to the moral law often leads to personal misery, the moral law itself becomes incoherent. The highest good must be possible for the moral project to remain rational. Since nature cannot guarantee this union, we must postulate the necessary conditions that do guarantee it.
This is where I have to introduce some friction, representing what many critics felt. Isn't this intellectually dishonest? Kant rigorously demolishes God with speculative reason, only to sneak God back in the moral window purely out of practical convenience.
That is a very fair critique, and it was widely leveled against him. Schopenhauer called it a moral theology. However, Kant's dissent is subtle.
Oh, gone.
He is not proving God's existence as a fact. He is proving God's existence as a necessary belief required by the structure of practical reason. We are not certain God exists. We are certain that we must act as if he exists for morality to be rational.
So the belief is rationally necessary, even if it is not scientifically provable.
Right. And this necessity leads to the three postulates of practical reason.
Items we must believe in. Vernunftglaube, or rational faith for morality to cohere.
First, as established, freedom, postulated to escape phenomenal determinism. Second, immortality. The demand for moral perfection or holiness is infinite. Since this goal cannot be achieved in a finite lifetime, the soul must be immortal to allow for the endless pursuit of moral perfection.
And finally, God.
God must be postulated as the omnipotent, omniscient, and just moral governor of the universe. Only such a being working outside the limits of the phenomenal world can guarantee that happiness is perfectly and ultimately proportioned to virtue, thereby ensuring the coherence of the summum bonum.
He rescued faith by placing it forever outside the jurisdiction of science. Kant didn't just end the Age of Enlightenment philosophy, he provided the genetic code, the fundamental theoretical structure, for nearly every subsequent philosophical movement.
That's absolutely correct. One can philosophize with Kant or against him, but one cannot philosophize without him. The core distinctions he established, Noumena, autonomy, the primacy of the subject, set the entire agenda for the next 2 centuries of thought.
Let's briefly trace some of this Kantian offspring. First, the early post-Kantian idealists like Fichte and Hegel.
They immediately radicalized Kant by asking the logical follow-up question. If the noumenon, the thing in itself, is defined as completely unknowable and inaccessible, why keep it?
Right, get rid of it.
They essentially discarded it and argued that the subject, or an absolute spirit, creates the entire world, leading to absolute idealism. Kant's critical system was designed to prevent idealism, but it logically paved the way for it.
Further down the road, you see his direct influence on core ethical thought, particularly on the concept of human rights.
Most notably in ethical personalism and modern rights theories. This entire movement is founded on Kant's powerful second formulation of the categorical imperative.
Act in such a way that you treat humanity, always at the same time as an end, never merely as a means.
It established the infinite, non-negotiable value of the person as a rational agent.
And the movements of the 20th century, like existentialism, owe a massive debt to Kant's concept of autonomy, even while rejecting his universalism.
Existentialism, from Kierkegaard to Sartre, built upon Kant's radical requirement for self-legislation. The idea that man is fundamentally free and required to create his own moral law is fundamentally Kantian.
But they rejected the idea of a universal moral law,
pushing instead for radical individual choice and responsibility, often leading to the anguish of having to invent one's own values. They kept the freedom, but lost the structure.
Even the analytical tradition, like logical positivism, which seems diametrically opposed, accepted Kant's destructive critique of metaphysics.
They absolutely did. They took Kant's critique that statements about God and ultimate reality are not empirical knowledge and radicalized it. They agreed with Kant that such metaphysical claims cannot be proven, concluding they are simply nonsense.
Like, because they can't be verified empirically or logically.
Kant framed the debate, even for his opponents.
Let's end this legacy section by highlighting the deep, enduring theological divide that Kant institutionalized, the conflict between Paul versus Kant.
This is the ultimate impasse that defines the relationship between faith and reason in the modern age. Kant's system explicitly enforces the separation.
On one side, we have the Pauline claim from Romans 1. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made.
Paul claims we can reason from the phenomenal world, what has been made, to the noumenal God's invisible qualities. The revelation is mediate, through creation, but it is valid and discernible by human reason.
On the other side, we have Kant, who insists that the restriction of causality means that bridge is permanently broken. We cannot, using legitimate reason, infer a cause for the universe outside of the universe itself.
The dilemma is absolute. If Kant is right, natural theology is impossible, and faith rests purely on moral necessity. If Paul is right, Kant's restriction of reason is an arbitrary philosophical boundary that denies the clear, rational evidence available to the mind.
And that conflict continues to define the theological and philosophical landscape today.
So, recapping the immense scale of Kant's achievement, he stepped into the crippling crisis between rationalism and empiricism, solved the 18th century puzzle by synthesizing them, and successfully defended the certainty of science by grounding it in the necessary structure of the human mind.
But in saving science, he paid a steep price. He created a new crisis, a profound alienation in Western thought by separating the knower from the thing in itself, severing the connection between facts and values.
Establishing a gulf that all subsequent thinkers have struggled to bridge. He was a man driven by deep moral and intellectual concerns, always seeking coherence. It's fitting to conclude with his most famous reflection.
The one that defines both the limits and the majesty of his entire system.
He was consumed by two things, the starry heavens above and the moral law within.
He sought to protect both. He gave the starry heavens the phenomenal world to deterministic science, making it fully subject to the necessary laws of Newton.
And he preserved the moral law, the noumenal world of freedom, immortality, and God, through the postulates of practical faith. He gave the heavens to objective science and the moral law to subjective, rational belief.
Yet, in doing so, he shattered the ancient and medieval synthesis that saw the heavens themselves as the clear and knowable glory of God.
He did.
Kant centered the universe on the human subject. The question that still haunts Western thought, the final provocative thought we leave you with, is whether this Copernican revolution truly liberated the human mind through moral autonomy and self-legislation, or if it instead permanently trapped the mind inside its own cognitive categories, forever sealing us off from true reality and leaving us only with the necessity of an unprovable faith.